The problem for me when I'm talking about Stalker is that I'm so often tempted to say, this is the greatest sequence in cinema history. There are loads of amazing sequences, but one of the most amazing, at the risk of inhabiting permanently the land of the superlative, is that long tracking shot when they're on a trolley car, they're in black and white, and there's that clank of the trolley car on the rails. And we see the faces of the three of them, Stalker, Writer, and Professor. And it's a very literal journey. But the sound of the clanking of the rails becomes gradually more rhythmic, hypnotic, musical, and electronic. And it lasts for an incredibly long time, and the focus is very much on their faces. And it goes on for long enough to lull us. We don't really know how much time has passed. And then there's this miracle, which, even having seen the film, I don't know how many times, it always takes me by surprise, where we go from black and white into colour. And, there's no point where they pass a sign saying, welcome to the zone or something like that. But at that moment, yeah, we are, that shift into colour, we are in the zone then. I first saw Stalker on its release in the early 1980s when I was living in London. And it was the very first Tarkovsky film I'd ever seen. And it was billed, marketed as a science fiction film. But it was a bit disappointing as a science fiction film. I mean, although I was very familiar with slow cinema, it was very, very slow. I mean, I watched it with a degree of impatience, even though I'd grown up with the idea that a suggestion of boringness was often a symptom or side effect of quality. It really wasn't love at first sight for me. I think what was going on is there was a slight friction between my sense of how I wanted it to proceed, and I wasn't quite able to give myself over to its pace, even though Tarkovsky, to his great credit, when it was first shown to a sort of preview audience of Mosfilm executives, if that's what we can call them. Apparently they said, it's a great film, André, but could we speed up the beginning a bit? And he, erupted in fury and said, you know what, I'm going to make it even slower to make sure that if any idiots come in having wanted to see a different film, they've got time to get out. And he made a really good point there, I think, because in a way, if you sped it up at the beginning, that would have just prolonged the sort of decompression period when the audience get used to the particular pace of this film. So by keeping it slow at the beginning, Tarkovsky went some way to, let's say, calming the audience down, but still there was that slight friction I felt on first viewing. I just hadn't quite adjusted to its particular pace. I believe there are something like 142 shots in the film, and I don't know what the average is now. I imagine it's about 3,000 or something like that. And that establishes its particular rhythm. And, the strange thing for me now, having said that I was somewhat impatient with the film, when I watched the beginning, of course it starts very slowly with Stalker waking up in his house with his wife and kid. But thereafter, once he gets to the bar, it's actually a rather thrilling beginning. We've got a kind of chase sequence. I think that sequence is very interesting in several ways, partly because the chase doesn't really make any sense in that you can't really work out where they're getting to. they just seem to be going round in circles in a way. It seems peculiarly constricted, the chase in Stalker, and that seems to me to look ahead to what happens when they get inside the zone. But my problem was, when I first saw the film, is I really didn't know what I was watching. I'd been out of university a couple of years, and I was always, my training meant that I could spot a Christ figure at 200 yards. And the film is all the time dangling these kind of allegorical possibilities. And so I'd see sort of clues, and I'd think, the gulag, barbed wire, the sort of shaven head of the Zek, I'd see these things, and then I'd be ready to look out for that. But whatever the potential allegorical scheme of things was, in no time at all it would break down. You can't watch that film and not think of the gulag. It's not about the gulag, but the gulag is there as a kind of imprint on everything that you see. But it's not just some coded allegory of the gulag. And also it looks forward to Chernobyl. And I think one of the things is that the way that Chernobyl sort of wrapped itself around the film, in that to seal in the reactor, they entombed it in what they called the sarcophagus, which seems like something so close to the vocabulary of the film. And then now, of course, there are quite a lot of pictures, photographs taken in the zone of exclusion, as they call it, in the area around Chernobyl. And it looks incredibly Tarkovskian or zone-like. So it's very difficult to see the film and not see it as some kind of prophetic allegory of that which would happen at Chernobyl. When I first saw the film, and there's Stalker, there's writer and professor, so I thought, aha, we're dealing with archetypes here. But I like the way that they're very individualized. It's not like, okay, writer represents the arts and professor represents scientists.
Вы канистру не забыли? Здесь полная.
Turns out that they're much more interesting at the level of individual psychology than they are as emblems or mouthpieces of some sort of occupational archetype.
Вот я давеча говорил вам, вранье все это. Плевал я на вдохновение.
I've now seen the film very, very many times. And the first ways in which I used to see it, I would just go to see it at the cinema or wherever it was on. But, since then I've watched it, on my computer looking at specific scenes. What I'm really struck and amazed by is that you might have thought that process of examination, this sort of almost like a post-mortem, would mean that I'd sort of done it to death. But in fact, I'm often getting asked now to introduce screenings of Stalker. And the sequence of events is always the same. I think, okay, I'll just watch the first 10, 15 minutes. I'll just wait till they get into the zone, because I love it when it gets into color. But to cut a long story short, I end up watching the film all the way through again. There's nearly always something new that I'm noticing. And my sense of its profundity has been increased, not diminished, by subjecting it to this sort of forensic scrutiny. It's one of the things that's so intriguing, the way that it so determinedly resists definitive interpretation in a way that's entirely appropriate to the zone. Because one of the things about the zone is that it's always changing according to what's going on in people's minds. And the key thing is, I think, that it's both completely ordinary and absolutely magical simultaneously. The things that make it the zone are achieved very, very modestly by about, 3 or 4 rusty tanks sitting in the middle of a field.
Ну что ж, пора.
I think also it's one of the things about film generally. You come out of a film and the world is altered. Now, the crappier the film, the shorter the duration of that alteredness is. So we come out of a really shitty film, and but still for about 3 or 4 seconds, there's that jolt as you emerge back into the world, and the world you see has been altered by the cinematic experience. The better the film, the longer that lasts. You're haunted by the film. For me, the world outside the screen was permanently transformed, I think. My perception of the world was permanently altered by that film. And also my sense of the possibilities, the potential of film, of the cinema as a medium, my sense of that was permanently expanded by the film, partly because of the moment at which I saw it. And it's one of the things that I constantly think about. I think, why is it that this film had such a hold on me? And I wondered if it was perhaps because that landscape which Tarkovsky had opened my eyes to. And I realized, yeah, this is new to me, but at the same time, I think I responded to it because actually it was the opposite of new. It was a landscape that I was so familiar with from my childhood. I grew up in this little town in England, and at one point, there were 4 railway stations serving this small town. So near where I lived, there were these abandoned railroad tracks, which had been, very quickly overgrown with stinging nettles, all that kind of stuff. So this world that I was seeing for the first time here on the cinema screen was also really part of my formation, deep in that kind of the unconscious that is one's childhood. As the film went through numerous rewrites, it moved quite a long way from the book it was based on. And a number of things happened. First of all, there'd been an earthquake where he'd originally wanted to film, this sort of desert region. So they swapped to Tallinn in Estonia, a completely different kind of landscape. And then what happened is that they shot, I think, they'd shot about half the film. They'd used up half the money. And then there was a screening, and clearly something had gone wrong. And there's so many different versions of what's happened. Either something went wrong in the processing, somebody blamed the DP. Anyway, something went wrong. It was unusable. And this caused huge problems. At one point, it looked like the production would have to be abandoned. And then they did some sort of recalculations of budget. They got more money. They were going to turn it into a 2-part film. So it was salvageable. But during this long delay, Tarkovsky completely reconceived the film and crucially reconceived the character of the Stalker from being what he called some sort of hustler, really. He turns him into this believer, this holy fool. And it's perhaps quite an interesting thing in cinematic history, the way that the things which threaten to completely undermine a film end up contributing to its eventual greatness. As I started to watch the film repeatedly, it was nice that I could see how some of these effects were achieved technically, but as is not the case when you see how a magician does a trick, and at that point the magic is over. Actually, I found weirdly the magic was deepened by my seeing how certain effects were achieved. So, for example, they're in the zone, and Stalker says to Professor, "Go on, you take the lead."
Идите первый, профессор.
There's a cut, and we then got a point of view shot of what Professor is seeing. He's walking along, and then the camera sort of passes into this abandoned vehicle, and grammatically we're still within Professor's point of view. And then the camera looks through the window of this abandoned, rusting vehicle. And then into shot, there appear Stalker, Professor, and then Writer. So the person whose point of view we thought we were sharing has actually stepped into shot. And what that does, it means that there is this other point of view that it turns out we've been looking through. Whose point of view is it? Well, there's only 3 of them, and they're all accounted for. They're all in shot. So there is this 4th consciousness. What consciousness is it? Well, it's, of course, the consciousness of the zone itself.
Люди.
I think that's one of the ways in which we get this combination of the place being ordinary, because it's just like so many of the places I saw as a kid, and at the same time, it's it's sentient. It's got a consciousness of its own.
Кто вам сказал, что здесь действительно желания исполняются?
The zone is alleged to have all of these properties, and at some point they get into an argument about what's going on in the zone, and I think Professor says to writer or the other way around, how do you know that? And he says, well, he told me.
Да и вообще, кто вам рассказал про зону, про дикобраза, про комнату эту? Он.
And it turns out that their and our only sense of what's going on in the zone has come from Stalker. But when Stalker says about a given place that, yeah, you know, this, you've got to do this and that, it's almost impossible not to absorb that sense.
Послушайте, если вы вдруг что-то заметите или даже только почувствуете что-то особое, немедленно возвращайтесь.
That's brought out very clearly quite early on when he says to Writer, you can't just go walking straight up there. And Writer, who's just sort of cynical, embittered writer, says, well, you know, I'm going to do it. So he starts walking on, and then there's that voice saying, stop, comes from somewhere.
Стойте, не двигайтесь.
And then nobody can quite work out where that voice has come from. And Professor says, oh, but you just internalized it because, you know, you actually just became frightened. In other words, it's impossible not to have your sense of the zone configured by what Stalker has said.
Зона – это очень сложная система ловушек, что ли. И все они смертельны.
And the thing is that it both does adapt itself to what's going on in your head, and at the same time, always, yeah, it's just an ordinary place. So the meat grinder, this fearsome place, well, it's just a place where the plumbing is far from adequate.
Вам повезло, вас она предупредила, а могла бы и не предупредить.
And the key things is that both writer and professor, there are representatives. So at whatever point when they are persuaded, oh yeah, this is a scary place or a magical place, then we're following them. So they articulate some of our doubts, and then their suspicions and ours are assuaged. And the way that Stalker has, if you like, advertised this particular holiday in his brochure is by saying that at the heart of the zone is a place called the Room where your deepest wish will come true. And of course, that's a nice idea. Yeah, what could be better? So I think it's quite important at the end of part one, we actually get a view of the Room. And it really is only 200 yards away. It's really quite, it's within, you know, it's practically within spitting distance. But by then, because of the things that Tarkovsky has set up early on, we never again think, oh, you know, why don't we just walk there? By the end of part one, we've completely given ourselves over to this timeless, unmeasurable extent of the zone. What happens at the beginning of the film, there's a very literal journey. As the film unfolds, so that literal journey dissolves into an increasingly interior, psychological or philosophical or metaphysical one. And the more the film goes on, so the amount of ground covered diminishes. And that's partly because the physical obstacles put in their way increase, but also they encounter all sorts of minor problems. So at one point, Professor has left his rucksack behind. And Stalker remarks rather wittily, who cares? You know, you're going into the room. If that's your deepest wish, you can have thousands of rucksacks. But he has to go back and get it. Stalker has said there's no going back. So, you know, Professor at that point is dead. So he and Writer press on through, you know, all sorts of rather soggy, demanding landscapes. And then they go on and they chance upon Professor.
Вот и он.
There he is with his rucksack, sitting by a nice little sort of campfire. They end up sort of where they were a few minutes before. And what's happened is that any sense of time and space, of here and there, of before and after, has collapsed. And each person has a different apprehension of it. And as we get closer to the room, we move into these environments, if you like, which are much more obviously constructed, and they seem more sort of, as it were, dripping with some sort of symbolism. There's a huge sort of internal room of sand dunes, like some kind of art installation. And then there's the meat grinder, the very damp, dripping, echoey tunnel, which we've been told is the scariest place in the whole of the zone, and Reiter is the one who has the unlucky task of going on point. Every step that he takes, we're just wondering what is going to happen, and, you know, the truth is that nothing much happens. The crucial thing is that anything could happen at that point.
Это ерунда. Еще там, под гайкой, зона пропустила вас, и стало ясно. Уж если кому и суждено...
And then they find themselves in what is, as it were, the ante-room to the threshold. And that's a scene which it seems to me is so important. They've been having this argument. Everything is very intense. And then suddenly, the phone rings in this place when you'd have thought, you know, there wouldn't be a working phone line. And one of them picks it up and says, "No, this is not the clinic," puts it down again. And then they look at the phone, and it's a moment of real kind of laugh-aloud comedy if you see it in a theatre with a lot of people.
Не трогайте!
So I love the way that at this very nearly climactic moment, we get this sort of easing of the tension. They then go from this ante-room to the very threshold of the room. Stalker says to them, "This is the most important moment of your life."
Это самый важный момент в вашей жизни.
And at that point, we believe him absolutely. And there's this wonderful expression of faith. And he says, you know, and the most important thing is for you to believe.
Главное, верить.
One of the things that happens in the film is that things are shifting all around you. And then as they get nearer the room, so the full implications of this futile absolute, where your deepest wish can come true, become clear. Because it's not just your top 10 wishes that are going to come true, it's your deepest wish. That is to say, what's going to be revealed to you in the room is who you really are.
Не знаю.
And that means that what had once seemed a wonderful prospect, we're going to have loads of money. In the case of Reiter, I'm going to sell loads of books or recapture my inspiration. It becomes maybe my deepest wish is actually to avoid coming face to face with myself like that. The room accesses a different level of your identity than you have access to. And Stalker's teacher, Porcupine, he saw something so terrible about himself that he killed himself.
Почему еще раз не пошел? Теперь уж точно не за деньгами, а за братом. А? Как раскаялся?
Он хотел. Он, я не знаю, через несколько дней он повесился.
Да здесь он понял, что не просто желания, а сокровенные желания исполняются.
Essentially, nobody wants to go into the room, it turns out. At one point, Reiter almost accidentally falls into the room. If you look closely and you keep an eye on the sort of schematics of it, the only thing that ends up in the room is the camera. And it doesn't seem to me to be making too much of a claim that, oh wow, the deepest wishes of cinema itself have been realized in the course of this film. David Thompson, who is not an unequivocal admirer of Tarkovsky, he wonders what the room is going to be, and he says something like, oh, well, it might end up being resembling just a sort of a rather small, damp screen in your local multiplex. I really hate it when I go to the cinema and I think, oh, great, the film's going to end now. And then it turns out, oh, no, there's another bit. There's another 3 bits. But in this case, you could be forgiven for thinking, oh, that's the end of it. But it's not. There's a number of important sequences. We end up suddenly back in the bar where it started. There's no explanation of how they get back from the zone to the bar. They're drinking, they've had this big adventure, and the stalker's wife turns up. And, you know, she could be forgiven for thinking that they haven't done anything. They've just gone boozing in this bar for however long it is, however long they've been away. There is one crucial thing that proves they've been somewhere, the dog. And it always makes me think of the famous passage from Coleridge's notebooks when he says, you know, what if you have a dream in which you go to paradise where you pluck a beautiful rose, and then when you wake up from the dream, you find rose petals in your bed. What then, Coleridge asks, what then? So the dog is proof of that they've been somewhere. And then a further kind of proof crops up, because at some point we're back in black and white, and then we get a shift back to color. Stalker's kid, she's in color. She is kind of living embodiment in the outside world of all of that magic. She exists permanently in the zone, if you like, because, yeah, we see her in color. We're told that stalkers will always have deformed children. So, as it were, her not being able to walk is the price paid for her father's crime of going to the zone. And Stalker is completely worn out by this experience. He's absolutely devastated by it.
Они ведь живут только раз. Разве такие могут во что-нибудь верить?
Успокойся. Не надо.
And then the very last sequence of the film, which apparently Tarkovsky got the idea for it slightly late, very late in the day. We go back to color and we see the kid again. She's sitting at the table and begins telekinetically moving these glasses along the table. And it's funny, I guess, by the standards of advanced special effects, it could hardly be more simple. But it's one of the most powerful, I think, depictions of that which in the real world might be physically impossible. Just as Stalker has said to writer and professor, the most important thing is that you believe. I mean, we believe in that absolutely. And, we can watch that film, that sequence really, really closely, and we can't see we can't see how it's done. But that's the wonder of cinema.